Hello, and welcome to this roundup of historical romance books with the word bride in the title. I'm Olivia, your favorite resource for book recommendations you can easily screenshot. You're watching Random Olive Reads. Duke Seeks Bride by Christy Carlisle is book 3 of the Love on Holiday series. Our guy Alex is a new duke with a marriage stipulation in his father's will, stating that he needs to get married in 6 months in order to keep his castle in Ireland. His annoyingly meddlesome aunt has tried to matchmake him with a wealthy widowed countess and invites her to the castle for some supposed equestrian charity event. The countess sends her secretary instead, mostly to avoid the matchmaking. Evie is the ultra organized secretary who's been working with the Countess for the past 3 years, but also secretly writes romance novels in her spare time. When she shows up at the castle, she is shocked to find that they were expecting the Countess, even though a letter should have explained the switch. Alex and Evie have actually met briefly once before in the garden of a ball, but Evie is very much aware of her social status and that a romance between her and the Duke is impossible. It's not actually impossible since this is a romance novel after all, but it takes some time for each person to realize that they really do want and need each other. Bride by Mistake by Anne Gracie is book 5 of the Devil Riders series. 8 years ago, Luke had rescued a young girl from the Spanish roadside, delivered her to a convent, and then married her for her protection. Now he's found out he cannot get an annulment, so he's come back to claim her. Before they leave Spain, she needs to visit her hometown to find her sister, so there's a lot of road trip travel along the Spanish countryside. Both Isabella and Luke have lingering traumas from the war and have a lot of trouble communicating with each other. It was nice to see a road trip in a different setting here and uncover a few more mysteries from Isabella's past. The Heiress Bride by Madeline Hunter is book 3 of the Duke's Heiresses series. New Duke Nicholas is still adjusting to his inherited status and feeling the stress of his responsibility. He's surprised when he receives a visit from the last of the late Duke's heiresses, Iris. She's a rare book dealer and has come to inquire about a particular rare book that the late Duke had said he would assist her in finding. Iris had only recently learned that the Duke had passed away and is completely surprised by her inheritance. Nicholas agrees to assist her in finding this book, but is also suspicious of Iris, so he wants to keep a close eye on her. This is another book in this series where two main characters really start on opposite sides of an argument, but can't seem to stay away from each other. This book was really interesting in terms of Iris's family history and a big scandal with her grandfather. Lessons from a Scandalous Bride by Sophie Jordan is book 2 of the Forgotten Princesses series. Cleo has been courting a very elderly earl, much to the concern of her family. She has a good reason, though. She's looking to marry someone who will not, or cannot, make demands of her in the marriage bed. Cleo has had the trauma of caring for too many siblings, watching the weak ones die, carrying away the stillborn ones, and seeing her mother suffer the ills of labor. She wants very much to avoid that type of life and entrapment, so she avoids men who might prompt that type of future. Meanwhile, Logan is in London to find an heiress to marry and restore his castle in Scotland. While he's busy courting some vapid debutante, he's more intrigued by Cleo and says that he'd rather marry her instead. She refuses, of course, but he's pretty persistent in his pursuit. How to Lose a Bride in One Night by Sophie Jordan is book 3 of the Forgotten Princesses series. We start with the wedding day for Annalise, where she's marrying a handsome duke and then setting off on a honeymoon barge on the river. Except her charming duke turns out to be an attempted murderer, suffocating her with a pillow and then throwing her in the river. She washes up on shore, unconscious, and rescued by Owen, an earl back in England from war with his own nightmares and demons as a former assassin. Owen is stuck with an injured, feverish, and unconscious Annalise until he finds some assistance with her care. When she regains her consciousness, she pretends she has amnesia so she doesn't risk being returned to her terrible husband. With a broken leg, Annalise is even more vulnerable to danger, but somehow extracts some self defense lessons from Owen, despite his hesitance to get closer to her. These two are very clearly attracted to each other, but Annalise is keeping secrets, and Owen is all sorts of emotionally damaged. The Duke Buys a Bride by Sophie Jordan is book 3 of the Rogue File series. Marcus has run away from his ducal responsibilities after he catches his best friend with his stepmother in a compromising position, and he's on his way to his estate in the north of Scotland. On the way there, he comes across a village wife auction and buys slash saves the girl who's being so crudely sold off. Now, Alice has been married in name only to her late father's friend since she was 15 and provided childcare to all of this man's children. She thought her childhood friend was going to come rescue her in the auction, but he just ran off. So, even though she's purchased by Marcus, she has no idea who he is or if he's trustworthy. And he says that theirs won't really be a marriage and he's going to employ her as a housekeeper. Sounds pretty familiar. From here, we end up on a road trip romance, traveling on horseback, stopping at various inns, etc. The Duke's Stolen Bride by Sophie Jordan is book 5 of the Rogue File series. Impoverished oldest sister Marion seeks to save her family's circumstance by becoming a courtesan, except she doesn't have any experience, so she seeks out the neighborhood depraved Duke Nate for some lessons. He's insulted at first, but then gives in, and the relationship is mostly him trying to get her to loosen up. It's sad to see how very poor Marion and her family are and how their choices are limited, but Nate feels sorry for her and also desires her so much that he can't seem to stay away. The Rake's Insatiable Bride by Caroline Lee is book 3 of the Those Kilted Bastard series. Jade seeks a knight with a male courtesan so she can lose her virginity on her own terms before her guardian and uncle forces her to marry. Cameron is a charming rake of a man who plays up his debauched reputation by giving women pleasure. Both are victims of a marriage by proxy scheme that surprisingly brings them back together and then forces them to stay in the same cottage during a rainstorm. While Jade had no intention of getting married, she's slowly falling in love with Cam as they spend more time together. It's an isolated little vacation for them until the storm breaks and we have to clear up the mess. The Duke's Daring Bride by Caroline Lee is book 4 of the Surprise Duke series. Alistair is a reclusive duke who doesn't speak much and also stalks the streets fighting crime as the Dark Knight. One night, he saves Olivia from ruin while she's out there looking for a juicy newspaper story, and she's out there because one of her investors has pulled out funding for her newspaper. That investor happens to be Alistair, and she shows up at his house the next day to ask him to reinstate his financial support, not knowing that he was the one who saved her at night. He decides to propose to her in exchange for the newspaper support, mostly because he needs a wife and doesn't want to go out into society to find one. These two enter into a marriage of convenience, but have an instant attraction for each other. Lord Holt Takes a Bride by Vivian Lorette is book 1 of the Mating Habits of Scoundrel series. This one has a female friend group who finds one of their own ruined and banished to the country, so they want to do some research on how to avoid rakes and scoundrels. They somehow kidnap Lord Holt so they can question him about his habits. Meanwhile, in the background, they're complaining about one of them not wanting to marry the oaf that her parents picked out. At some point, Winifred has run away from the wedding she doesn't want and into a waiting carriage. That carriage contains a certain Lord Holt, otherwise known as Asher, and off they go to run away from London and her unwanted wedding. There's some drama here involving ransom and whether Asher was an unwilling participant in the road trip, but circumstances here push them together. The Improper Bride by Lily Maxton is book 5 of the Sisters of Scandal series. Henry is a Marquess and basically the most unlovable, friendless asshole ever, and he nearly dies in a fire at his estate. Miraculously, he survives, but is a curmudgeon during his recovery. The widowed housekeeper Cassandra is somehow tasked by the doctor to keep him occupied, so she asks for lessons in a foreign language. As they spend more time together every day, they grow closer and start to see the person beneath the title or the role that each person has. Of course, they've got that whole employer-employee relationship here and massive social class differences. So even any affection between them would be improper and lead to heartbreak. Henry's near-death experience has also reminded him that he has a duty to marry and sire heirs, so he enlists his sister in hosting a house party and bringing eligible women for him to meet. But none of them compare to Cassandra, so there's tons of emotional angst here. Chasing the Bride by Erica Ridley is book 6 of the Lords in Love series. Tabitha has been betrothed to her father's Viscount friend since before she was born, and with her father on his deathbed, the wedding shall be held in short order. Tabitha has no interest in marrying the lecherous old man, but feels that it's her role as a dutiful daughter to comply. She spends some of her last days of freedom at the Merriwell Matchmaking Festival, but her betrothed has assigned his man of business to watch over her. Hudson has worked for the old Viscount for years and has been unwisely pining for Tabitha, despite being at a much lower social standing. While he is competent at his assigned tasks, he is dreading the day when Tabitha must submit to marriage to the Viscount. And when she's spending time with Hudson, Tabitha realizes true joy in companionship, making her dread her looming marriage even more. She ultimately runs away from her wedding, hoping to forestall her fate for just a little longer, and Hudson eventually catches up to her, and she convinces him to spend a week with her before she has to meet her doom again. This book was a lot of fun to read with our two people falling easily in love, but kept apart due to external circumstances. The Bride Goes Rogue by Joanna Shupe is book 3 of the Fifth Avenue Rebel series. Catherine is finally going to settle those wedding details with the fiancé that her father arranged, only to find that Preston had no intention of marrying her at all. He's got a grudge against her father for abandoning Preston's family in their time of financial turmoil, so he wants nothing to do with their family. With Catherine suddenly unengaged, she's ready to find an affair, so she goes to a masked ball with her friends and meets a man there. When she goes to meet the man unmasked in a follow-up tryst at his apartment, she finds out it was Preston all along. These two spend a lot of time fighting and somehow call it truce, then start an affair, and definitely don't intend on getting married. But it's messy and complicated, and Preston's still mad at her father, and Catherine's dealing with her father moving on. Tempting the Bride by Sherry Thomas is book 3 of the Fitzhugh trilogy series. Helena is nearly caught in a compromising situation with a married man and then forced to marry her brother's best friend and actual enemy David. What she does not know is that David has been in love with her for decades and only tries to catch her attention by antagonizing her. She shortly gets into an accident where she's gravely injured and wakes up with no memory of her supposed husband. Now that David has a second chance to make a first impression, he's kind and solicitous, and he is just so scared of the day that Helena gets her memory back. It's the worst sort of pining that David has for Helena with his own self destructive behavior. Thank you so much for watching this video. Hopefully you found a book or two to add to your TBR. Links to all of these books are in the description box. Like and subscribe to get updates, and you can follow me on Instagram at randomolive.